Hello everyone, welcome to lesson 7, the final lesson of the portrait painting course. And this one is going to be concerning painting dramatic light and sort of building on the previous the previous 4 lessons. A lot of it is going to be sort of echoing what I talked about in painting fantastical light. And so just to start off, I again have a bit of a checklist as in the previous lesson that I want to walk through and sort of give you as like a cheat sheet of how to achieve a more dramatic light setup, and it's really pretty simple. First off, as previously, I'm going to start off with the direction of the light, and in this kind of a setup that I want to achieve, something that gives me a large area of light and a large area of shadow is good, because then I have space to create contrast within those. So, you know, something like this, more of a like a 3/4 kind of a Rembrandt setup works well. Something more extreme than that, where the light is coming more from above, has a more dramatic effect still. Anything from like a 3/4 to a fully top/side view works well. If you can't really achieve this effect of drama and contrast if you don't have big light and shadow shapes. So if I go in here and I just do like a very front oriented direction, then I'm not really going to get far with it because I don't have space for that contrast. These are just going to be accents and not really what creates a strong contrast in the sense that I'm looking for. So that is really the distinguishing thing to achieve here is just a good amount of light and shadow shapes. And obviously either light or shadow can be predominant, but you still want to have a nice balance. And so if I go in here and I do this, this can still work, but it's just going to be a little bit more difficult because I'm lacking my my light shapes. But you know, it's not such a big issue. But if I go in here and I like have the whole thing in shadow, and I just have like a rim light, that's going to be a bit more difficult because the shape again is so small that it looks like an accent. But it is still like this can still feel very dramatic. And so the point to take away here is, even without large light and shadow shapes, you can achieve a dramatic effect. But it's generally a good idea to have shapes that are visually strong enough to be seen as large rather than as accents. So like the perfect setup might be what I had at the very beginning, but as I go into this or this, it becomes less ideal, but still workable. And really, the reason why this is just the fact that if you have a strong value contrast, it really trumps everything. And so if I look at it like this, and I set everything up with a high contrast, like so, you can see how dramatic it feels. And really, this is the main point: is a high contrast between light and shadow will create a dramatic effect, and the light direction is somewhat secondary. So if I do the same thing in here, it also works in the same way. But now I'm just gonna have to render it a little bit differently, and I'll really focus in on an example that might look a little more like this with just like a good balance. So I touched now upon the light direction and the value, but further talking about value, it also helps to note that in most cases you're going to want to have your background be fairly dark, and that is because in general your shadow is determined by your environment. So and the background kind of symbolizes, if it's flat like this, it's sort of like a symbol of contextualizes the environment, right? So if you have a dark background, it sort of stands to reason that the ambient light would be low, and by extension your shadows would get pretty dark. And when you have a setup like this, it also creates a sort of a hierarchy between depth, where since the background is dark and the shadows are dark, they're gonna feel like they're further away. But I'll touch on this a little bit more when I talk about brushwork. For now, though, there's really 2 important things, and that is a high contrast between light and shadow, and in general, a dark background. And so direction is covered. value is covered, and now we arrive at color. And when it comes to color, really you can get some color within your light and your shadow. So if I go in here and I make this like blue, it can work fairly well. But one thing to note with that is that I'm not, in most cases, naturally, I'm not gonna be able to have a strong saturation within either the light or the shadow, because, or at least it's not gonna feel very vibrant, because the shadows are too dark and the lights are too light. So like this color, even though it is fairly saturated on the wheel, it's not actually really saturated when you look at it visually, and so you shouldn't really count on a strong saturation. In most cases, you're going to be able to get more saturation with your lights, because they're not going to be generally completely blown out, so you might get like a more colorful light, sort of like this. And you're going to have specifically the biggest amount of possibility for saturation within your halftone. So in this kind of a dramatic setup, color is very secondary, and so is the direction of the light somewhat. As I mentioned, really the contrast, the value contrast is key here. As I've touched on these very broad topics, I want to get a little bit into rendering, and when I talk about it, I also get into saturation somewhat. But the main point that I want to get across in this case is that your when you have a strong contrast like this, you need to be very careful to group your lights and your shadows, because when you have a range that is this large, you can very easily get into the trap of picking a color that is somewhere in between, or a value, more specifically, that is somewhere in between. So maybe like a mid value for your halftones. Now it wouldn't be this color, but maybe something like this, and going in with that and over rendering and over killing the contrast in the light. But that is not really how light works. It groups very strongly, and really the deepest halftones that you're going to get are at the terminator, at the edge of light and shadow. So the thinking here, the mindset would be to really reserve your darkest darks for a very few, or your I should rather say your darkest lights, because obviously the darkest darks are going to be in shadow, but the darkest colors within the light you should reserve for a very select few places. And as you render something like this forehead, for example, you don't want to go too heavy on transitions. You actually want to stay very grouped in terms of value, and preferably add more contrast as you go. Like you wouldn't want to get in here and all of a sudden start adding very deep halftones in a form like this from the get-go. You want to keep it more moderate in most cases, and then as you work you might add more contrast, but all throughout just being very careful not to overkill the contrast. You know, this needs to be one cohesive visual shape, right? Or at least the local value here does, and so does the shadow. And really in most cases, regardless of what the local color of the object is, your light is going to be one shape and your shadow is going to be one shape in this sort of a high contrast, high light contrast setup. So that is one element to keep in mind when talking about rendering. And so I talked about just separating and selecting values for the big shapes of the light and the shadow. I've talked about specifically working within the light and adding halftones. The same could be said about the shadows. Like if you want to go in and add bounce light, you generally don't want to go too crazy with it, because you'll destroy your grouping and your visual effect will it will be watered down. So if you go in and add reflected or bounce light within your shadows, you want to have follow a similar principle as with the halftones in lights. Like you want to group the reflected light in shadow as well. And now, as a sort of a final layer to rendering an image, I have a couple examples, regarding this final thing to watch out for as you go into actually adding brushwork and rendering. As you go in there, and this ties in with what I mentioned with your background. If your background is dark, which it generally is going to be because it reflects or rather the colors and the values of the shadow reflect the background. If the background is dark, then it's going to create an effect where you know that the background is far away, and by extension, since the shadows are similar color and value, they're going to read as far away as well. And the detail is going to be lost within those. So what you want to do is keep your edges more lost, less sharp within the shadows, and really add detail and focus within the light as you render. And then as you get into actually adding brushwork, you want to have the thickest strokes, or at least visually the thickest strokes in terms of like either like an oil effect or just strong texture contrast. You want to have those in the light because that's going to feel more material, and that material is going to feel material as in like a thick paint is going to feel even closer than if you just had a light value. So here's an example of what I mentioned with generally if you have dark shadows, your background is going to be dark as well. And this is a Caravaggio painting. And I'm sure the reproduction doesn't do it justice at all, but you can see that he had a tendency to either group the shadow and the background value very close, or even completely lose the edge in some examples. And it works very well here. And you can imagine how weird it would feel if there was just like a white background here. It's just very off-putting. So this is what I was talking about with, you know, having an analogy between your background and your shadows. And here are some examples of having that thick brush work in the lights. Now this might not be a perfect example because it's very abstract, but you can still see even within something that's this strange and experimental, that the thick strokes, and even though they're very, very thick, they're done on the light or in the light shape rather than here in the shadow. And if you zoom in, you can see how actually glazed and shallow this layer of paint is in relationship to the entirety of light. And with something that's a little bit more well, a lot more refined and rendered, you can also see that the real thickness of strokes is on the very highlights, and then the shadows are actually, a lot of them show through the underpainting in this specific case of oils. But the principle is there, and it really does apply to digital as well. So when you get into rendering, this is definitely something to watch out for, is obviously grouping, but then at the very final stages, when you start adding brushwork and start working that out, edges, and then finally your thickness, the thickness of the strokes that you actually make. Another sort of interesting thing that you can play around with is taking an image that you've done as like a low key, low contrast setup, and adding another light source, another contrasty light source, mostly like a rim light or like a top/side light, and creating a dramatic light setup with this. And I think it's just sort of like a cool thing that you can play around with. So if I had like a screen light or a screen layer and a strong rim light like so, I kind of maintain a bit of the quality that I had in my fantastical low contrast setup, but also add an accent, which kind of ties in with what I was talking about, with the fact that the shape of the light is so small that it doesn't really necessarily read as very as like a fully dramatic setup, but more so like an accent added on top of, in this case, like a low. And it does really have to be a low value, so a dark grouping to add a light rim light. But it is kind of a cool thing to perhaps try out and do a variation on some of the setups, some of the blockings that you had done previously for the 6th lesson. All right, and here's the rendering of the final guy. Now, you'll notice right at the very beginning, it's a pretty similar light setup in terms of the values, at least, to what I had in the first one. So what I do right away is I really darken the shadows a lot, and I start adding some occlusion shadows at the very get-go on the same multiply layer. And I also start, as before, flashing out the shadow shapes and trying to have them conform a little bit more to a like an abstract light logic. So I set them up first, and now I'm actually adding the halftones and saturating those. This recording is an hour and a half, and I sped it up, I think, 7 times. So it's or maybe 8. I'm not exactly sure, but it is sped up quite a lot just because again it's the fundamental things that are happening are the same, but there's some specific things that I'm focusing on that are different. And one of those in this one specifically is going to be trying to punch out that contrast between the light and the shadow to create more drama. And in this big shadow shape that I have, rendering things with really ambient light, and then later on you'll see as I add the reflections how much that pops out the form. So you see here, this is the point where I start thinking, okay, maybe it would be cool if I change the likeness. So what if I make the chin longer still and make the jaw a little bit less deep? So his whole face would appear a bit more narrow and a bit more villain-like in that sense. And then I also start changing the eye shapes as well, painting those out and liquefying a little bit to get a bit more of an evil look. So I want to raise the eyebrows maybe and make the eyes a little bit more like a cat. So have a positive cancel tilt them. And I'm thinking about a similar thing as I have with the second guy, where maybe I'll also have a blind eye, but in this case I don't really need the contrast in the eyes specifically because I have the contrast in the light and the shadow. So the really main visual thing that's going on is that big shadow shape versus that big light shape, and that's where the contrast is, that's where the drama is. And then I again revert as always to see what it looks like, compare. I'm pretty happy with it. So I think at this point I save and I start going in and really working in both the light and the shadow. And I was actually having quite a lot of trouble on this side because I changed the drawing, I changed the likeness, and it was feeling off. Like it wasn't really, the construction really wasn't good. And again, as I talked about previously, this is just something that you have to trudge through, and you have to revert back to a more simple thing. So like one thing here that there's gonna reverting back is I deleted the colored part of the eye. I just made the eyeball, and I thought maybe that way I can get a better rendering, a better light effect, and then I can add a multiply layer for the color. So I think that worked well enough, and that helped. But you'll see me change things up quite a bit there. I wanted to have like blonde eyelashes, but then I thought maybe you can have like mascara or something, like an evil pirate sort of character or something like that. And when I'm fairly satisfied with what I have in the big shapes, I create a soft light layer here, as you see, and I start adding really the lights. And since the light shape is so small, I actually want the lights to be very big and very pronounced. I merge those. I start polishing up things here further, and again, I'm changing that eye. I'm messing it up, and that's completely fine. And you just have to accept these things and not get too too stressed out by it, and just go with the flow. Because really there's no use in frustrating over it. So I darken the eye there quite a bit, and go back to that eye, and just struggle. But that's cool. And the only as you've seen throughout, like the thing that often solves my struggles, or really that always solves my struggles, the only thing that can solve my struggles and where I'm stuck in a rendering is if I go back, if I think about something that's more basic, less like detail focused and more fundamental focused. And I think that helped with the eye. I was really the issue with the eye, and really a lot of issues with rendering that you'll find are not going to be rendering based, but really drawing based. You'll have a weak drawing, so really when checking for what's wrong, a drawing should be like a go-to thing. Is like, is this constructed well? Does the big thing here, the big position feel right? You also see that I changed up the hairstyle quite a bit, and I made it a lot more flat. Like it feels more sleek, like Snape almost, like that sort of a character. I want him to feel a bit more greasy, and I think the likeness is also kind of like Snape, like with the hooked nose. I think that's a good villain trope. So although this was the course was in a big way about using light to convey character, obviously you want them to match. So maybe I could have kept the more sort of neutral or like a good guy looking likeness, but I think this just punches out the effect even more. Although that could have been an interesting thing as well to have like a sort of a cute or like a conventionally attractive likeness with like an evil sort of dramatic light. And now I'm adding the highlights on the hair. I'd added the scars on the shadow side as well, and I still haven't really added any highlights in that shadow, any sort of reflections, and that is this kind of and here I am actually adding those, and you'll see how much those help pop out things. I add them on the upper plane of the cheek, some on the plane next to the nose there, a little edge highlight on the lips, and I use the soft light because I don't really need a lot of contrast. So I'd added those all throughout the face there, but I'll eventually add them on the ear as well. And ears, I think, as I've mentioned, also tend to be pretty greasy, so the highlights there might even be stronger. So in here, I'm just using a normal layer. So depending on what I feel like or what is more convenient, I'll use a soft light or I'll use a normal layer. And you see on the ear specifically how much more skin-like and like ear-like that reflection makes the painting scene, but also how much stronger the form becomes. And this is a lighting sort of setup or like an effect that's used a lot in splash art. You'll see that within the shadows, often there will be, as on that color there, for example, there will be a lot of specularity and a lot of bands of reflections, and that will give the whole thing a bit more of a plastic feel, perhaps, but it will also have the form be readable and strong throughout. What I did here is I made the highlight on the hair a lot stronger, and I sort of added a glow effect there. And I think that that's a good idea in general. I added that in the highlight on the forehead as well. So there's a cast shadow from that hair on the forehead, and I want to have a strong saturated subsurface scattering effect around that, but I also kind of added a glow, and I think that works pretty well. Added some details on in the eye, some reflections, which makes it feel pretty specular, and some reflections around the eye as well, which make it feel moist. And I think that is kind of a nice effect. It feels pretty glassy. Added some bounce light there at the bottom plane of the chin and some of the jaw. And now I'm adding just some little changes with Liquify. And I think at this point here, this is going to be small tweaks regarding the lightness or some of the like inconsistencies in the light, figuring those out. But when I end up with this done image, or when the point where I end the recording is sort of where the image is pretty much figured out in terms of the light, and the only things that need to be added are like texture details and that sort of stuff. So with the wrinkles, really any wrinkles, you can sort of think about them. If they're small, you can just sort of consider them as one dark line and another light line, usually below it. So if the light source is above, the dark line will represent the plane going down in like around itself almost, and then the light line will represent the plane kind of coming out. And you can imagine it sort of just like as two very small half cylinders running into each other, if that makes any sense, the way that I described it. But you can see it quite clearly the way that I did it on the forehead there. I'm adding some saturated bounce light on the lips. And here at the very end, I'll actually end up doing a bit more subsurface scattering as well, after I add some like scar details. I'd added that scar to line up with the nose, and that's a big no-no in the design sense, because it's a bad tangent. So always thinking about that first, trying to look at that, and then if that's good, then I'll actually consider like the actual detail rendering stuff. Also added a cast shadow there. I don't know how specifically accurate that is, but I think it works well as a design thing. And here I'm using a soft light layer to add another pop of subsurface scattering, because the light is so strong that you would get that anyway. I think it looks pretty well. And here I'm just using a screen layer at the very end to show how I would add a rim light. And a rim light is a very it's a very generic thing in a sense, because it's so overused in the concept art world. So you don't want to add them just by default, but if you want to show even more form in the shadows, and as I've talked about, a lot of the form here in the shadows is popped out with that glossy effect, that those speculars. But if you want to have even more form, specifically on the edge, around the edge there, then you can use the rim light. And I used some reference for the rim light as well, for the shapes. I'd started with an option here that is a little bit more from the front, and I think it has a very nice subsurface scattering effect on the ear there. And a lot of people fail to add a cast shadow of the ear when they add a rim light to the back of the jaw there, back of the head. So that's just a kind of a useful tip to keep in mind. And then I added another option for the rim light, but this one is more behind the head there. So that's really all that I have in terms of the rendering videos. But I think I'll and hopefully they're sort of illustrative, and they show both like a progression, a way of working, and also like the fundamental important things as well. Hopefully I've brought your attention to those. So what I'll do now is I think I'll just hop out and show you the very final images that I ended up with, and maybe talk a little bit about those as well, but really just showcase what the actual completely finished result is. Alright guys, so I just wanted to check in here at the very end and show you what I came up with in terms of polishing up the 3 portraits. So with a lot of them, well, really with all of them, a lot of the work was around the parts that were in the face, because I didn't want to take up time in the time-lapse videos with that. But I also did some cleanup, a lot of changes in the hair as well compared to the face. The face was really just very minor things in most cases. So this is the first guy. This is the second guy. I really went in with the frozen effect, some of the icicles and stuff like that. And I also made my initial design idea of this strong contrasting eye even stronger. I lowered the contrast all over. I had some strong lost edges in here added, and I also made the edges around the top of the head softer as well by lowering the contrast. So now this is really a very strong accent. And with this final guy, I did a lot of changes, well, not a lot, but some changes in the hair and a bit more changes around the face as well, clearing up some inconsistencies, adding some bounce light, stuff like that, and obviously in the fur as well. And I try to make the fur different in all 3 of the characters. So this guy has more of hopefully a rugged look. This one is got some snow on it, and this one is just more soft and nice. So that's really everything with regards to this final demo, and hopefully the whole process is clear, and hopefully you got some value from seeing me and having me walk you through the whole painting, the whole rendering, and hopefully you can use the ideas that I discussed there, and hopefully they inspire you, the different demos inspire you in your final project as well. And now finally, your assignment for this lesson would be to create 3 different block-ins of a dramatic light setup. Really the main thing here that you would be changing is the direction of the light, and it would help to stay within a more extreme perhaps direction. So like a very strong top light, a very strong side light, maybe even a bottom light, something as this in here, and try to stay away from loop or butterfly or like a front light, because that's not really gonna help with achieving the effect that we're going for. You can also play around with different degrees of contrast. You will have a strong contrast necessarily, so it is going to be a less of a difference than having a completely different light direction, but you can still play around with having different amounts of contrast. So maybe like a very strong completely black on white, or like a slightly less contrasty setup. And also you can play around with having different colors, so a different color for the light or the light source, and then a different color for maybe like the fill light. And again, as you change the color of the shadows, you should also match it with the background. And then when you have the 3 setups, which you can, as with the previous lesson, do very quickly, you should just choose one and take it to a fairly finished level of rendering. Again, as with the previous lesson, doesn't necessarily have to be as rendered as the fifth lesson assignment, but it should be taken pretty far.